I flew roughly 70 missions over the course of 6 months before they pulled me out of the cockpit and told me I was going to the ground. Until then, my war had been measured in altitude, headings, radio calls, and fuel gauges. I knew the terrain from above, the rivers like thin scars, the hills like folded knuckles, the villages as clusters of roofs that all looked the same after a while. I thought I understood the fight. I did not. Becoming a forward air controller stripped away any illusion I had left about distance or safety. My job was no longer to fly over the war, but to walk inside it, with infantrymen who carried their lives on their backs and judged you by whether you kept them alive when things went bad. A forward air controller goes out with the ground troops. When contact happens, when the shooting starts, when the line breaks or the enemy digs in too close, it is your voice on the radio calling in the airstrikes. I had gone to FAC school, learned the procedures, the math, the timing, how to mark targets so bombs did not fall on friendly troops. On paper, it all made sense. In the bush, nothing did. The infantry did not think much of air wing officers at first. To them, we were people who had spent most of the war above it, coming and going, while they lived with it every hour. I was a second lieutenant, young, clean, and new to their world, and they looked at me like I had something to prove. I felt that pressure immediately. I wanted them to know I could do my job, that when it mattered, I would not freeze or guess or hide behind procedure. I wanted to show them that when I called for air, it would be accurate and it would save lives, not cost them. That desire sat heavy in my chest every time we moved out, every time the jungle closed in around us and the noise of the world narrowed to boots, breath, and insects. I learned fast that confidence on the ground was different from confidence in the air. Down there, nobody cared how many missions you had flown. They cared whether you listened, whether you learned, and whether you stayed alive long enough to matter. I did not yet understand how quickly the jungle punished mistakes, or how thin the line was between learning and dying. That lesson was coming, and it was coming soon. One of the first missions I went out on as a forward air controller was a resupply run. We were moving ammunition and food out to surrounding hills using Amtraks, those big armored vehicles that look like steel boxes crawling through the countryside. It was not far in miles, maybe 15 or 20, but distance meant nothing out there. Every meter of road had to be treated like a threat. You listened for sounds that did not belong, watched the tree line for movement that was too still, too deliberate. When the sniper fire started, you knew it instantly. There is a crack to an AK round that stays with you. Once you hear it, you never forget it. It snaps past you, sharp and personal, not like the distant thump of artillery or bombs. We dove into a drainage ditch along the road, hugging the dirt and trying to figure out where the fire was coming from. I was still thinking like an officer fresh out of school, still leaning on things I had been taught in classrooms instead of lessons learned the hard way. I had a square of fluorescent nylon cloth, bright enough to be seen from the air, and I told one of my men to put it on his helmet and step into the road so the aircraft could see our position. He looked at me for a long moment. He was experienced, calm in a way you only get after you have been shot at more than once. He asked me politely if that was what they taught me in FAC school. I said yes. Then he asked why I did not do it myself. That was the moment it hit me. Standing up in the open with a bright marker on your head was not bravery, it was stupidity. I got back down into the ditch and kept my mouth shut, and I learned something without anyone having to die for it. When the airstrike came in, it was fast and final. An F-4 rolled in over the tree line, low and hard, and laid napalm across the enemy position. The fire bloomed in a way that did not look real, like the world itself had torn open. We were hundreds of yards away, and you could still feel the heat press against your skin. Napalm is not abstract when you see it that close. It is not a word in a briefing. It is fire that eats everything it touches. That was my first real combat lesson as a forward air controller. War was not theory. It was adaptation, listening to the people who had already survived and understanding that mistakes were paid for immediately, often in blood. After that mission, I stopped believing that anything in Vietnam followed a clean set of rules. People like to think war is organized, that there is a right response for every situation if you have been trained well enough. What I learned instead was that war is on-the-job training, and the price for learning too slowly is paid by someone standing next to you. Mines and booby traps were part of our daily routine. They were not rare, not exceptional. They were expected, like the humidity or the insects. You learned to look at the ground as carefully as you looked at the tree line, because the enemy was just as comfortable killing you from under your feet as they were from a distance. One day, a young engineer was walking point ahead of the Amtraks, sweeping the road the way he had been taught. He was new in country, barely settled into the rhythm of movement and fear. He found a mine and began to uncover it, doing exactly what his training told him to do. Somewhere in that process, something went wrong. There was a dull, heavy sound, the same sound every explosion seems to make when you are too close, and then there was nothing left of him in one piece. I remember seeing a large green shape flying through the air and landing near me. It took a moment to understand that it was part of his body. He was the only one killed in that blast, because everyone else had cleared the area the way you do when someone starts working on a mine. The sad truth was that the newest men often took point, not because they were careless, but because someone had to, and the numbers always worked against them. The enemy was smart. They changed their tactics constantly, adapting as fast as we did, sometimes faster. Plastic charges that could not be detected. Triggers hidden where you would never expect them. Every step was a calculation, and even when you did everything right, the margin for error was still there. I began to understand that survival had less to do with courage and more to do with awareness and luck. You stayed alive by paying attention, by trusting the men around you, and by accepting that control was mostly an illusion. The jungle did not care about rank or intention. It only reacted to movement, noise, and mistakes. And it reacted without mercy. There was one mission that stands out because nothing happened on the way out. That alone made it feel wrong. Almost every day we took some kind of fire, even if it was just a few rounds, to remind us we were being watched. That day, the road stayed quiet. No sniper cracks, no movement in the trees, no sudden shifts in the air that made the hair on your arms rise. We moved along the route like men who knew better than to relax, because silence in the jungle is never neutral. It feels staged, like a held breath. I remember thinking that it felt too easy, and that thought bothered me more than incoming fire ever did. I had a bad feeling about that mission, strong enough that I acted on it. I walked most of the way in the tank treads, stepping exactly where the Amtraks had already crushed the ground, because I did not trust the untouched earth beside the road. We had swept the center line, done everything by the book, and still I did not believe it meant anything. Experience had already taught me that doing things right did not guarantee safety. It only reduced the odds slightly. When we reached our destination without incident, part of me felt relief, but another part stayed tight, waiting. On the return trip, the quiet continued. No ambush, no shots, just the sound of engines and tracks and boots. It felt like walking through a space that was being deliberately left alone. I was sitting in the back of the Amtrak when it happened. There was no warning, no build-up, no chance to react. The mine was command detonated, triggered by someone who had been waiting patiently for the right moment. It was a plastic charge, impossible to detect, designed to rupture the fuel cells underneath the vehicle. The explosion lifted us into a world of fire. The Amtrak became a furnace in an instant. Flames rolled through the compartment, and the air itself seemed to ignite. There was no time to think, only time to move. I jumped clear as fast as I could, dove over a barbed wire fence, and felt my flak jacket tear and burn as it scraped against the metal. That quiet mission, the one that felt wrong from the start, had been saving its violence for the end. When I hit the ground, I did not realize I was on fire. Shock does that. It narrows your awareness until only the next movement matters. Then I heard someone yelling, telling me I was burning, screaming it over and over until it cut through. I looked down and saw flames climbing up my body, feeding on the fuel, the fabric, anything they could find. I became a moving torch. The men around me did not hesitate. They grabbed me, slammed me to the ground, and started beating the fire out with their bare hands. They threw dirt on me, packed it against the flames, smothered them the only way they could. There was no equipment for that kind of moment. There was only instinct. When they pulled off my flak jacket, it took skin with it. Both of my arms were burned badly, the flesh coming away in sheets. I remember seeing it and thinking it looked unreal, like it belonged to someone else. There were 30 of us burned in that explosion. 5 men did not make it off the Amtrak fast enough. They died right there, trapped by fire and fuel, gone before anyone could reach them. Movies lie about that kind of thing. You see characters run through fire and come out with singed hair and soot on their faces. That is not how it works. Fire does not care who you are. It does not respect courage or training. It takes what it takes. The medics moved as fast as they could, but there was only so much they could do. When one of them reached me, he told me he was out of morphine. He said he was sorry. I told him I did not need it. I truly believed that at the time. I felt numb, distant, like my body had shut down to protect itself. He told me I would need it later. He was right. We called for medevac, and it was already on the way. The men who had saved me stayed close, watching, making sure I stayed conscious. Those were kids, many of them younger than me, and they had just dragged someone out of a burning vehicle without thinking twice. That was the warrior spirit in its rawest form, not speeches or medals, just refusing to let someone die if there was anything at all you could do about it. The pain came later, exactly the way the medic said it would. Once the shock wore off and the nerves that had been burned raw started firing again, it was unstoppable. It was not sharp or sudden. It was everywhere at once, a constant screaming sensation that left no space to think. We were taken from the field to a field hospital that was already overflowing. Wounded men were everywhere. Some were alive and crying out, some were silent and still. There was no sense of order beyond triage and urgency. War does not wait for hospitals to be ready, and nobody plans enough beds for what actually happens. They gave me morphine when they could, but even that only dulled the edges. Time stopped making sense. I remember flashes instead of sequences, faces leaning over me, hands working quickly, someone saying I would be moved again. I learned later we were there for 3 days, but it could have been 3 hours or 3 weeks. Pain medication blurred everything into a haze where consciousness drifted in and out. From there, I was put on a flight to Japan, to a burn center in Yokosuka. I do not remember the trip. I do not remember the aircraft The only way to survive pain like that is to be unconscious. And my body took every chance it could to shut down. Even after we arrived, the suffering did not pause. Burns do not heal quietly. Infection and dehydration are constant threats. At one point, while waiting to be processed, I was left sitting outside in the blazing sun with no water because paperwork had not been completed. They could not give me anything until I was officially checked in. I remember screaming that I was going to die right there. I remember vomiting and slipping into delirium before someone finally intervened. When I woke up in a ward, a nurse told me I was a miracle patient, that most people who reached the state I had been in did not survive. That was how close it had been. Not just the explosion, but everything that followed it. Recovery was not a single moment of relief. It was a long sequence of ordeals that had to be endured, one after another. At the burn center, the nurses and medics did things to us that would sound cruel to anyone who had never seen burns up close. To keep infection down, they had to strip away dead tissue, scabs, old medication, and rot. They called it a shower, but there was nothing cleansing about it. It felt like being burned all over again. After that came the salve, thick and heavy, and it burned just as fiercely when it was applied. Every treatment reset the pain, dragged it back to the surface, and reminded you that healing was not gentle. The medical staff survived it the only way they could. They used humor, dark humor, because without it, the weight would have crushed them. They call us crispy critters, a joke borrowed from a breakfast cereal that existed back then. It sounds terrible, and maybe it was, but it was also human. It was their way of staying functional in a place filled with suffering. I asked one of them how they managed to see injuries like that day after day. He told me they had to look past it, had to laugh sometimes, because if they stopped feeling entirely, they could not do their jobs. I understood that. We were all finding ways to survive, just in different roles. The strange truth about burns is that despite how horrific they are often superficial. Organs are usually spared. If you can fight off infection and survive the dehydration that comes from wounds that never stop weeping, you have a chance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I crossed that line. After nearly 4 weeks, I was stable enough to be sent home. I had to be off pain medication to qualify. Officially, that was the rule. Unofficially, I wanted out badly enough to bend it. At night, when the pain kept me from sleeping, I used Jack Daniels instead. 2 days without prescription pain meds was enough to satisfy the requirement. It was not noble. It was survival. And it got me on a plane home. Coming home did not feel like an ending. It felt like crossing into another kind of fight. We landed at Travis Air Force Base on a medevac aircraft, and some of the guys kissed the ground when they got off. They were that relieved to be alive, that relieved to be back on American soil. I understood it, but I did not have the strength for gestures. From there, I went into the Oakland Naval Hospital, first into old wards left over from the Second World War, then into a brand new facility. They gave me 30 days of convalescent leave and a bag full of pain medication. I had lost a frightening amount of weight, dropped from over 200 pounds to around 160. My muscles had wasted away. Even walking was work. Recovery was slow, uneven, and humbling. My wife went back to finish her degree, and we rented a small apartment in McMinnville. Life resumed in fragments. I returned regularly to the hospital for skin grafts and follow-up treatment for nearly a year. During that time, I was surrounded by other young men who carried wounds far worse than mine. One of them had lost an arm and a leg. I remember him saying nothing was going to keep him from going home and fishing and hunting again. That kind of attitude stayed with me. Being around those men taught me that life is fragile and stubborn at the same time. It breaks easily, but it also refuses to let go. Eventually, they planned to send me back to a squadron, not on flight status, just paperwork, 6 months left to serve. I had earned the rank of captain, a Purple Heart, and 5 air medals, and yet all I wanted was to go home and live a normal life. I applied for disability and was granted it. I remember bouncing down the hospital stairs, knowing I was done, knowing my wife would finish school and we could finally move forward. I survived Vietnam, not because I was fearless or exceptional, but because others acted when it mattered and luck held long enough. That is the truth I carry. Survival is not glory. It is responsibility, memory, and the obligation to remember the men who did not make it out.